Hello, Internet. This is Olin from What I'm Listening to. As you can see, this is a significantly different type of video than my usual videos, and partly because I wanted to take a break from a new editions or whatever project I'm working on because I'm a little under the weather and I really haven't felt like editing something. But I'll have something up the following week. But today we're going to do a tier list on my favorite band, one of my two favorite bands, Wilco. I have always wanted to do one of these tier list videos because lots of YouTubers do them, and I just felt it was kind of perfect to focus on one of my favorite bands ever, talk about all of their albums and their discography. I should preference, this is personal opinion stuff. I know some people try to approach this more critically than others, so they might say this album is arguably better than the other, but I'm just going purely by my own opinion, my own personal thoughts on these albums. So without further ado, let's do this. So first album we have here is AM, the band's very first album. Much more alternative country sounding, and that's just because Jeff Tweedy freshly formed this band only months after his first band, Uncle Tupelo, broke up. Uncle Tupelo being one of the big names in the alt-country world. And AM is very clearly a first album. It's not bad, it's not fantastic, but you can tell that there's potential there, and he just has not been able to harness it. There's definitely some highlights, though. Box Full of Letters, I Must Be High, Passenger Side. Great tracks, but again, not every track is perfect, and there's just something that it's missing. I think I would give this one a B, a solid B. Like I said, I like it a lot, but compared to some of the other albums, it's not nearly as great. Okay, moving right along, we have the second album, Being There. This one has a special place in my heart because it is the first Wilco album I ever listened to. I was super into alt country when I first discovered it, and actually I have to say this might have been the album that really got me into alt country, but I was really curious about that genre, and so this was the album that I went to. And it's there's a lot of content on it. There's 2 discs worth of stuff, and I just love it. I love it so much. I actually re-listened to it not too long ago and found myself singing along to every single song, and just really reminded me how much I love the album. Some great songs on here. Jeff Tweedy's songwriting is just stellar. It's kind of incredible, the jump he made between AM and this album. So with that being said, this to me is a special, an S tier album. It's so very good, and it's definitely a landmark album in their discography because it's more or less the last alt country album that they would do. Moving right along, we have the Mermaid Avenue album. So this one's kind of funny because there's 3 volumes, and I could technically rate all of them individually, but I think just to make things easier, I'm gonna just rate this one. This is volume 1's cover, but it's gonna represent all 3 volumes. I'm gonna do them all in one tier just because I think it's simpler. But Mermaid Avenue, this is a really cool project because Woody Guthrie, this famous folk artist, had written tons and tons of lyrics that never formed into full songs. And one of his daughters found all these handwritten lyrics that were unfinished tracks and decided to commission some musicians to make them into full-fledged songs. So she reached out to Billy Bragg, who's an amazing folk, anti-folk, I don't know what you want to call him, I guess just folk singer. And he took a look at the tracks and took a look at the lyrics, and he decided that he wanted to work with Wilco with the music because he thought that Wilco's being there was a really, really great album that captured sort of the essence of like 50s American music. So they both went into the studio and worked on these tracks, and a lot of them are really, really good. California Stars is an easy highlight. Way Over Yonder in the Modern Key, Hoodoo, Voodoo. These are all tracks on Volume 1, but there's one track on Volume 3, When the Roses Bloom Again, which is a very sad sounding song, but I think is really uplifting in its own way. Really, really pretty. The Mermaid Avenue sessions are grand. There are kind of a lot of tracks to get through if we're ranking this as 3 albums in one. Some of them are a little more forgettable than others, but the ones that hit really hit. It's really hard to rate. I think I'm gonna give it an A. I'm gonna give it an A because it just seems criminal to not give it anything higher than that or lower than that. Solid tracks. Okay, so moving right along, we have Wilco's next album, Summer Teeth. Now, this is a weird album because this one is not folk, it's not Americana, it's not alternative country. The band went full-on experimental art pop on this one. And what really contributes to this is the member Jay Bennett, who was in the band at the time. He was sort of this multi-instrumentalist, mad scientist type who would play everything he could get his hands on. He would tinker with stuff, and he really contributed a specific noise to Wilco's music for the time, and a lot of people will only listen to the albums that he's on just because of that. This album is basically just him and Jeff in the studio, and they would just do drugs together and talk deeply about various subjects, write songs, experiment, and it's a really sweet sounding album, but if you listen to the lyrics, it's really dark. You can tell that they come from a very dark, almost disturbing place, yet surrounded by the sweet, sweet melodies. It's just like this weird juxtaposition. It took a while for me to fully appreciate this album, I think. I remember hearing it and not liking it initially because it was an alternative country, but now that I'm kind of aware of where it's coming from and what the band does as far as just not wanting to do the same thing every time, I can easily appreciate it. I think I'm going to put this one in the B category. Very similar to AM, it's a great album, but it's also not perfect, and I think it's just Jeff stepping out of his comfort zone as far as music goes. He did alternative country for all his life, and now he's doing a completely different sound. But they didn't really get to their full potential until the next album. And that next album, of course, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. Now, this album is considered the band's best, and it's such a great album. You know what? I'm gonna put it right there because why beat around the bush? Despite it being kind of lame to agree with the critics and saying that it's a great album, it is truly a great album with an incredible backstory, and it's all documented on this movie called I Am Trying to Break Your Heart, which is worth checking out. But Yankee Hotel Foxtrot basically takes Summer Teeth and really, really goes full experimental, and it just sounds so, so good. A lot of people kind of call it the Radiohead of alternative country, which is kind of a weird way to put it, but I could see where they're coming from when they say that. I could go on and on about the album, but for the sake of this video, just know it's phenomenal, and if you haven't listened to it, definitely check it out. Check out the background of it. It's a great story, and it's amazing. Okay, moving right along, we have A Ghost is Born. This is an album that I remember not really liking initially, And I don't know what it was. I guess maybe it just didn't sound like Wilco to me. It wasn't quite experimental, but it wasn't quite country. It's a new sound. It's, I think, a more simplified sound for the most part. There are elements of folk. There are elements of just alternative rock, and it kind of marks a weird period where they're kind of diving into like what we call like a dad rock sound. There are elements of experimentation, and that's thanks to producer Jim O'Rourke, who worked with them on Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, and Jeff even formed a band with for a little bit called Loose Fur, which is kind of a more experimental post-rock band. But anyways, these sessions are interesting because Jay Bennett was kicked out of the band, and they kind of lost that sound that Jay really contributed. So Jeff was sort of on his own as a guitarist. He was now the lead guitarist, and was kind of insecure about that. He'd always really been like a rhythm guitarist or bassist in previous works, and here now he was on his own. So you can tell that the guitar solos are a little lacking in comparison. Some of the tracks might sound a little simple, but overall, what they did with this album is incredible. And much like Summer Teeth, it comes from a very dark place because Jeff was realizing that he had an addiction to painkillers. And after this album's recording sessions were done, he ended up checking himself into rehab. So you could say this album is a drug album, for sure. So I'm going to give this one an A. It's not perfect by any means, but it's so very good. Okay, so moving right along, we have Wilco's live album, Kicking Television. I wasn't initially going to talk about this album, but I felt like I should because it's actually one of the few live albums that I really like. At this point in their career, they enrolled a couple more musicians, one of which was guitarist Nels Cline, who's still in the band today. Nels has a pretty crazy background in music. He's done a lot of jazz stuff. He's played with a lot of other people, and he's just overall a really talented guitar player. So Jeff was able to wrangle Nels into the band, and this album is sort of like the debut album, and all the tracks on here are just insane. They're all songs from the previous albums, but with Nels' additional guitar work, there's just a whole new light to it. There's some songs that almost borderline shoegaze. There's some that have guitar solos that you wouldn't have expected to be in, but they just work so well. And I think just as musicians, the band really shines well. You can feel their chemistry, and you can tell they're having a great time, and Jeff especially is in a better headspace compared to the Ghost is Born sessions. So I think I'm gonna put this one in the B category, and that's partly because when I first listened to it, I thought it was a phenomenal album, and then I went back to it, and I still really liked it, but I wasn't quite as blown away by it. And also, it's a B category album just because it's just the same songs rehashed, slightly tweaked, but for the most part, it's the songs that we know and love. Okay, next up we have Sky Blue Sky. This is the first proper studio album that Nels Cline has appeared on. And talk about dad rock. This is an album that a lot of people describe as a dad rock sounding album. And you could take that or leave it. It's not a sound for everybody. I was sort of iffy about it. I think I've grown to appreciate this album a bit, and there's some definite highlight tracks on here. But overall, this is an album I really don't go back to that often. So I think I'm going to put this one in the C category. I don't think it's a bad album by any means. I just think it's not my favorite personally, and I think it's just, compared to the rest of the albums that we've talked about, it's a little more lacking. And yeah, I don't know, it just didn't completely do it for me, but I still think it's really crucial in the band's discography. Next up, we have Wilco, the album. Yet another kind of dad rock sounding album. Not quite as atmospheric, I'd say, compared to Sky Blue Sky, but still some good tracks on here. I think the band is being a bit more playful on this album compared to the others. I think they are at a point in their careers where they're not being terribly serious musicians. A lot of their other albums are a bit dramatic. I mean, case in point, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, Summer Teeth, A Ghost is Born. Those just, they're so dark and a bit dramatic. So Wilco the Album, I think, is a bit more on the playful side of things, and I think that's really cool to see that they're able to just make music and just have fun with it. But overall, I think it's an album that, I think people will either dismiss or not really think anything about. And it's not that it's a bad album, again, but it's not really the perfect Wilco album. And in my eyes, it's one that I don't really go back to as often, but I still appreciate it. So I'm going to lump it together with Sky Blue Sky. It's a C album. Not bad. Not great. All right, next up we have The Whole Love. This is actually a really, really cool album. It shows the band kind of going back to being experimental, somewhat in the same vein of Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, but maybe a more modern, or this iteration of the band, since Jay Bennett is no longer in the band and they have a slew of new members. It opens up with this really great song called Art of Almost, which has this like weird, glitchy, disjointed drum rhythm that eventually sort of makes sense, and you're able to kind of get the pattern of it, and then eventually it just turns into a normal song. And the guitar solo in that song is face melting. That's a fantastic Nels moment there. But there's also some other straightforward folky songs, like Black Moon is one of my favorites. Kind of another sad, melancholic, but bittersweet song that I like quite a bit. I Might is also another great song. And then the final track, One Sunday Morning, song for Jane Smiley's Boyfriends, a 12-minute epic that really just enjoyable the whole way through. I definitely think it's an improvement compared to Sky Blue Sky and Wilco the Album. Again, it's not the perfect Wilco album to me, but I'm going to put it in the B category because compared to the last two, I like that one a lot more. All right, next up we have Star Wars. This is an album that I love to death. And it's kind of funny, like, of all albums to really enjoy, there was just something about this one that I really like. And it could have just been timing. It could have been where I was in my life when it came to me. It could have been the fact that it was released for free out of nowhere on Wilco's website. And, I listened to it like crazy, and I ended up just really, really digging the style they were going for here. They were being a little more experimental. They were even incorporating space rock elements, which is so weird for a band that primarily does folk and alternative country. There's even times where the band sounds like a glam rock band, like Jeff's almost channeling David Bowie on some of these tracks, and I love it. I actually would hope that the band would do another album kind of in this style, because I just think it's such a brilliant album. You know what? I'm going to just say this is an S album for me. This is an album I go back to all the time, and I think is super underappreciated, and I just love it so much. Okay, next up we have Wilco's album Shmilko, which is a lovely reference to Nilsson, Harry Nilsson's album Nilsson Schmilsson. This is a much more subdued album compared to that of Star Wars. It's more folky, more Americana, a little hint of country in it, but it's also a very personal record. Jeff's really thinking about his upbringing as a young American in a town where there's not a lot of people living in it, and that he lived a simple life. And it's very touching, I think. Despite the cover being kind of cheeky and low-key disturbing, the whole album is really, really heartwarming, and I think it's one of their more prettier albums that they've done. I personally like this album a lot. I'm going to put it in the A category. I think Jeff's songwriting is really, really great on here, and, you know, much like what you could hear in Kicking Television, the live album, you know, this point in the band's career, these guys have been playing for years, and their chemistry is just on point. They know what to play. They are really in tune with what everybody else is thinking, and it really shows on this album. All right, finally, we have Ode to Joy, the band's most recent album. This is an album I actually haven't really listened to nearly as much as the rest. Of course, I had to get it because it's a Wilco, and anything the band puts out, I will pick up. But just to kind of preference things with this album, before this came out, Jeff was really starting to dive into working as a solo person. He had released an album with his son Spencer, just under the name Tweedy, which is a band unto itself, but I would almost call it a solo album. He had released his first solo album, and he had also released another album where it was just him playing Wilco songs on acoustic guitar, which is a beautiful, beautiful album. I'm not going to talk about it on this tier list because it's not really a formal Wilco album, but highly recommend checking out that solo album. You know, I think with this album, it to me just sounds very, very similar to Jeff's solo work. And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but I think it left me kind of bored with this album overall. It just didn't feel completely like a band album. It just felt like more of the same of what I'd heard. I'm going to rank this one as a C album. Again, it's not a bad album, and I think I would be able to enjoy it more if I wasn't paying such close attention to Jeff's solo work. But I think I wanted something kind of like Star Wars or Being There, or, you know, something where you could tell it's more band oriented, and I just didn't really get that from Ode to Joy. All right, so that's my tier list there. As you can see, I'm very biased. Nothing ranked below the C category. It was all C's through S's. But yeah, that's how I feel about the band. I love this group so much. I really trust whatever Jeff Tweedy puts out is going to be great, and whenever they put out a new album, you can bet your ass that I'm going to buy it. If you're a fan of Wilco, let me know what you think. Where would you rank your albums? I'd be really interested to know which ones you liked, which ones you didn't like. And let me know if you also liked this video. I am totally down to do more tier lists here. There's lots of bands that I like and lots of albums I'd like to talk about and see where I'd put them on a ranking board here. But until then, I'm all done here. This is Olin from What I'm Listening To, signing out. Goodbye. Thank you for watching.